The latest and probably best hypothesis so far on the biblical exodus out of ancient Egypt is the one proposed by Old Testament scholar James Hoffmeier.
What I like to do is to explore what I could consider the background evidence. What is...
Based on more than a decade's research and archaeological work, Hoffmeier's hypothesis represents the best, most consistent, and most coherent hypothesis so far on the biblical exodus.
Because this is really the story about the exodus, the exiting of the Israelites from Egypt.
And just like all the previous hypotheses before it, this one is also based entirely on historical, geographical, and textual inaccuracies and contradictions.
Geographically, this makes no sense. Strategically, it makes no sense. So I hand it to the pastors and say, boy, is this good sermon material.
And they departed from Ramesses in the first month, on the 15th day of the first month. And the children of Israel removed from Ramesses and pitched in Succoth. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot that were met.
As far back as the early 20th century, scholars have identified biblical Ramses with northeastern Egypt.
Was there a city in what the Bible calls the land of Goshen, the northeastern delta of Egypt, called Ramses? And the answer is yes. The principal study was done by none other than Sir Alan Gardner. He did the premier study on this way back in 1916 and documented every known reference at that time to a place called Ramesses and determined that there was indeed a place in Egypt called Ramesses. It was located somewhere in the northeastern delta based on the text, but nobody could find it archaeologically, at least not up till that point.
In the Hebrew Bible, the city of Ramses is mentioned by name only in the Pentateuch. And we don't find any mention of this city again by this particular name after the book of Numbers.
With reference to Ramses, we have actually 5 occurrences of it in 4 different passages: Genesis, Exodus, twice in Exodus, and also in Numbers 2 times.
The next time that P. Ramses is mentioned in the Hebrew Bible is in the book of Psalms, and by the name Zoan, often translated as Tanis.
Out of the ruins of Ramesses, a new city was built, and that city the Bible calls Zoan, Z-O-A-N, Zoan in Hebrew. In Greek, so depending on your translation, it might come off as Tanis. And this city flourished from 1070 all the way down to AD Roman times. Very long history.
In Psalm 78, Zoan is explicitly identified as the place where Moses performed his miracles in front of Pharaoh, thus making a direct historical link between Zoan, or Tanis, and the city of Ramses.
When the psalmist recalls God's miraculous deeds done in Egypt, he talks about this happening in the fields of Zoan or Tanis. Now that's interesting because when the psalmist is writing, the city of Ramses didn't exist. It had been gone for about 500 or 400 years. So instead of naming the city that's now gone, he named the current city, which was within the basic neighborhood.
According to the Pentateuch, Tanis was the launching point of the Exodus, the place where the Hebrews began their migration out of this country.
In Exodus 12:37 and the 2 Numbers references, it's the launching point for the Exodus. That's where they leave from to start the departure. So that's very important because it gives us a reference point that we can look for. Is there such a place is there a dot we can put on our map to start our MapQuest search for the Promised Land?
And the first stop after Tanis was Succoth.
And the children of Israel removed from Ramesses and pitched in Succoth. And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth, about 600,000 on foot.
Hoffmeier identifies the Succoth of the book of Exodus and the book of Numbers with modern Tel el-Meskuta.
There is a site, which you can see right here, called Tel El Maskuta in Arabic.
He bases this connection entirely on the slight resemblance between the Egyptian name Cheku, Arabic al-Maskuta, and the Hebrew Succoth.
And you don't have to be a linguist genius to recognize that in that name Maskuta, you can see the name Sukkot preserved. This actually derives from an ancient Egyptian term named Cheku. Cheku is the name of this entire region here, which was one of the eastern provinces of Egypt.
This connection could very well be accurate, and we find no explicit opposition from the biblical text, which provides us no more description of the Succoth of the Exodus, other than that this city was located somewhere between P. Ramses and the second station on the Exodus, biblical Etham.
And the children of Israel removed from Ramesses and pitched in Succoth, and they departed from Succoth and pitched in Etham.
At this point in the hypothesis, Hoffmeier makes a great leap in the sequence of events, as they are described in the Bible, and jumps instead directly to the exit out of Egypt.
There were two routes in and out of Egypt,
while completely ignoring two important steps that are detailed in the biblical account. The first stop at the city of Etham, and the second stop at the crossing point of the Red Sea, after returning from Etham. This detail in the Exodus narrative is completely ignored by Hoffmeier, who only later identifies sites in the Sinai desert as biblical Etham.
It's called Chetem en Charu, the fortress of Charu,
and the crossing point of the Red Sea.
And you'll see that this area here is this big lake off to the right, that this ancient lake system out here on the right is the Sea of Reeds of the Bible. And
without explaining the implications that these sites would have on the migration patterns of the Hebrews, if they really are the sites mentioned in the Bible. His reason for ignoring these details will be clear at the end of this episode. Hoffmeier locates the only two possible roads out of ancient Egypt.
We have two roads that lead out of Egypt, two routes.
The first road, the road that was known to the Egyptians as the Way of Horus, and identified by Hoffmeier himself as the road that is known in the Bible as the Way of the Philistines. The road that the biblical text clearly states was not taken by the Hebrews.
And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines.
The way of the land of the Philistines, the northern one that hugs the coast. And what we're told is that God says, don't go that northern way, because you're going to see war and you're going to turn back.
And the second road, which went through central Sinai, and identified also by Hoffmeier himself as the biblical Way of Shur. The road that the Bible clearly states was taken by the Hebrews.
And they went out into the wilderness of Shur.
There is a second route, which the Bible calls the way to Shur. But these are the two ways in and out of Egypt. So if you want to leave Egypt, you have two choices.
So far in the hypothesis, we've pinpointed the city of Ramses.
Here is that site of Ramses that everyone now agrees is the area that the Bible is talking about.
We have found a good candidate for biblical Succoth, the first place where the Hebrews camped after leaving Ramses.
In that name Maskuta, you can see the name Sukkot preserved.
We have jumped to the exit roads out of Egypt and have located the only two possible routes out of the country. The northern route, the road that the biblical text clearly states was not taken by the Hebrews, and the second route, which went through central Sinai, the road that the Bible clearly states was taken by the Hebrews.
And they went out into the wilderness of Shur.
It is here that Hoffmeier deals himself the death blow, when he turns biblical history on its head and contradicts the biblical account completely, by suggesting that the Hebrews actually took the northern route out of Egypt. The same route that Hoffmeier himself and the biblical text clearly stated was not taken by the Hebrews.
And it came to pass, when Pharaoh had let the people go, that God led them not through the way of the land of the Philistines.
When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the land of the Philistines, although it was near, for God said, "Lest the people turn back." So initially, they didn't want to go out the one way because he was afraid they would turn back. Now they're going out a different way, and God says, turn back. But basically, we see them turning back up to the area they originally were trying to avoid. As an archaeologist, looking at it from a geographical standpoint, it doesn't make a lot of good sense. But boy, does it make good sermons. Geographically, this makes no sense. Strategically, it makes no sense. So I hand it to the pastors and say, boy, is this good sermon material. Because sometimes God sends you in directions that make absolutely no sense.
The era is 13th century BC Egypt. In the years preceding the death of Ramses II, in 1213 BC, an event which the biblical account ties directly to the date of the Exodus.
Pharaoh's chariots and his host hath he cast into the sea. His chosen captains also are drowned in the Red Sea.
From P. Ramses in northeastern Egypt, the Hebrews will first migrate west, before turning south towards the southern borders of ancient Egypt. On their migration towards the south, they will pass by an unknown region, which they call Sukkoth.
And the children of Israel journeyed from Ramesses to Succoth.
The next station on the Exodus was Etham, a city that is said to have been located on the very edge of the desert, the southern desert of Egypt. Once the Hebrews reached this region, they did not continue straight south into the desert through northwestern Sudan, a region that was known as the land of the Philistines, and was named after an ancient Egyptian tribe that lived on southwestern Egypt and northwestern Sudan. We will cover the Philistines in future episodes. The reason for not taking this route, even though it supposedly was the closer route, is explained in the text.
When Pharaoh let the people go, God did not lead them on the road through the land of the Philistines, although it was near, for God said, "Lest the people turn back when they see war and return to Egypt."
The reason was that there was fear that some of the Hebrews would surrender after seeing war and return back to Egypt by turning north again.
There's a fear if they go on this road of the land of the Philistines, something's lurking out there that'll scare the bejeebers out of them. They're going to make a U-turn and come back.
They made a peculiar turn to where they had originally come from.
And the Lord spake unto Moses, saying, Speak unto the children of Israel, that they turn and encamp before Pi-hahiroth.
It's a very important word in Hebrew, shuv. This is the word the prophets use for repent. You're heading down a certain path, you're supposed to shuv, you're supposed to turn and come back the opposite direction. That's the word.
Why would the Hebrews return north when they were being persecuted by the Egyptians, who were besieging them from the north? Why turn back north? Why not just cross the Nile from the southern borders of Egypt? The reason for the Hebrews' peculiar choice to go back north to the same place that they had originally escaped from was not religious or symbolic, as claimed by Hoffmeier.
Because sometimes God sends you in directions that make absolutely no sense.
But simply historical and geographical. It was to return to the only geographical point in all of Egypt that allowed the hundreds of thousands of escaped Hebrews to make a safe crossing over to the eastern side of the Nile, to the lowest point of the Nile Cataract in the city of Aswan, the driest point of the Nile, and therefore also the safest place for the Hebrews to cross the river. The crossing point of the Exodus is described with one of the most explicit descriptions in the entire Bible.
And go between Pi-Hahirot, between Migdol and the sea and Baal-Zephon. It's as if the biblical writer is trying to tell us exactly where the miracle of the sea occurred.
Clue number 1. The Yam. As explained in a previous episode, the Yam is the river of Egypt. 4 distinct terms are used in the Hebrew text to identify the river of Egypt: Mayim, Yeor, Nahar, and Yam. It is not a mystical, symbolic, or metaphorical place, as claimed by modern biblical scholarship.
We must also consider Yam Suf as a mythological term that was just explored.
It is simply the river of Egypt. It is the river that Pharaoh's daughter washes herself in every morning.
And the daughter of Pharaoh came down to wash herself at the river,
and the river that Pharaoh visits on his daily morning routine.
Rise up early in the morning, and stand before Pharaoh. Lo, he cometh forth to the water, and say unto him, Get thee unto Pharaoh in the morning. Lo, he goeth out unto the water.
Maybe Pharaoh and his daughter from Tanis walked hundreds of miles every day to go wash themselves in the Red Sea. The Yam is the river that the Egyptians drank from.
And all the Egyptians digged round about the river for water to drink,
and the river that the Hebrews will drink from on their 40 years long wandering in the Saharan desert. Thus answering a vital question that was asked in a previous episode. Where are the 11 million gallons of drinking water that we today know would be necessary to sustain on a daily basis the millions of Hebrew migrants? It would not be too healthy for the Egyptians or the Hebrews to drink from the Red Sea. This Yam was dried up by a strong northern wind, or Qadim Ruach, as it is described in the Hebrew text, always translated as an eastern wind, to further propagate the idea that the Hebrews were crossing the Gulf of Aqaba, and an eastern wind dried up the Red Sea from the right.
East of where the Israelites are in Egypt. Here is the area of Ramesses. And so we have the Israelites living here in the land of Goshen. And so if we have the wind blowing east, you see where the locusts are going to head, right towards this large Balach lake system.
Qadim, a Hebrew word meaning forward or frontal, a clear reference to the north, and in this case to a northern wind that pushed back the Nile River and allowed the Hebrews to cross over on dry land. Pharaoh, after seeing the Hebrews encamped at the Nile Cataract, makes an interesting proclamation.
For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in.
The desert has shut the Hebrews in, and not the sea, which would be the more accurate statement if the Hebrews were crossing the Red Sea and were blocked by the Gulf of the Red Sea.
For Pharaoh will say of the children of Israel, They are entangled in the land, the wilderness hath shut them in.
Clue number 2. Pi-Hahirot, the mouth of the gorges, and a reference to the Nile Gorge, or the Nile Cataract in Aswan. Clue number 3. Migdol. This word simply means tower or fortress, and is always translated so in the Bible.
Magdala means tower, fortress, lookout. There are places all over the Middle East called Migdol or Majdol today, or Magdala, and maybe you know a lady in the Bible named Mary Magdalene. Magdala means tower, fortress, lookout.
Except in the book of Exodus, where this word is translated as a name for a specific region or city in Egypt.
If we can find Migdol, we have found the location of the sea, because the sea they crossed, we're told, is beside Migdol. So we know that the border of Egypt, in this area, there was a site that goes way back called Migdol.
Migdol here actually means the same thing that this word does in every other verse in the Bible. It is simply a noun, describing tower or fortress. But which tower? Which tower or fortress is the author of the book of Exodus describing here? The answer is given in the same verse. The Tower of Baal Zephon. Baal. Scholars previously believed that this was the name of various gods and deities worshipped by different cults in the Levant. But recent discoveries have shown that the name Baal was actually associated with one particular deity, the storm and fertility god Hadad. In Greek culture, Hadad was equated with Zeus, who plays a similar role in Greek mythology. In Roman culture, he was Jupiter. In Egyptian pantheon, Hadad was equated with the god Amun. But what is the connection between Amun and the crossing point of the Hebrews? The connection is both historical and symbolic. In 13th century BC Egypt, the greatest monument erected by Ramses II were the Abu Simbel monuments in southern Egypt, in the city of Aswan. The construction of the monuments took more than 2 decades and were dedicated primarily in honor to the goddess Amun. In 13th century Egypt, the Abu Simbel monuments of southern Egypt would be equivalent to today's Freedom Towers in New York or the Burj Al Arab in Dubai, as the most significant monument erected in the region, and would be an excellent reference point to give the Hebrews on where to camp after reaching the Aswan Cataract. Right in front of the Tower of the Sea, the Tower of Aswan. Amun, being associated with Hadad, the god of maritime protection, who was believed to protect his worshippers during distress at seas and in water. What better place to drown Pharaoh and his army, to demonstrate the strength of the God of Israel?
Baal, who is a storm god, he's depicted in mythological literature as defeating both the chaotic sea god, the sea god Yam. Like the storm gods in the myths of Israel's neighbors, Yahweh heaps up the waters with a blast of wind. He wins a stunning victory. He establishes himself as the God of the Israelites. The drowning image is used metaphorically, as it is elsewhere in Hebrew poetry, to describe the Egyptians' humiliation and defeat.
A modern updated version of Exodus 14:2. The book of Numbers provides us further details on what happened after crossing the Nile.
These are the journeys of the children of Israel which went forth out of the land of Egypt with their armies under the hand of Moses and Aaron. And Moses wrote their goings out according to their journeys by the commandment of the Lord. And these are their journeys according to their goings out. And they departed from before Pi-hahiroth, and passed through the midst of the sea into the wilderness, and went 3 days' journey in the wilderness of Etham.
After crossing the river, they migrated south again, to the same desert, the desert of Etham, but this time on its eastern side. And from the eastern side of the Nile, they continued their migration towards the eastern coast of Africa by migrating along the Nile River. After having exited Egypt's borders months earlier, they again came back to the Yam Suf, to the Nile River. a gem of a historical clue left deliberately in the Hebrew text to show that the Hebrews were migrating in the Saharan desert, where they had access to the same Nile River that they had access to in Egypt. And from the southern parts of the Nile River, they went into the desert of Sin.
And they removed from the Red Sea and encamped in the wilderness of Sin.
And from the desert of Sin, they finally reached Mount Sinai.
And they departed from Rephidim and pitched in the wilderness of Sinai.
Which will be the point of our focus on the next episode.